There's been a question on my mind for quite a long time now, and it creeps back into the windshield of my thoughts almost every single day. And that question is, realistically, what does FromSoftware do after Elden Ring? In so many ways, Elden Ring feels like the end, specifically the end of how far a formula can be stretched. It feels like the logical conclusion and the grandest possible cohesive vision for a game of this stature and scale. I've watched and experienced FromSoftware's journey from their humble beginnings in Kingsfield all the way to the overwhelming success and taking the entire world by storm with Elden Ring, and all of the entries in between that led them up to this point. Every single title building upon and iterating more than the last. While there have been some more experimental games and even non-Souls titles to come out of FromSoft lately, Miyazaki has stated recently in an interview that even though their last couple of titles, after Elden Ring have been primarily multiplayer focused, that does not mean that as a studio they're changing their direction entirely to move away from single player games. But, almost 4 years later, Elden Ring really does feel like the absolute peak of what you can do with the tried and true Souls formula predominantly found in these games. This is backed up by the fact that FromSoftware's new titles, Night Rain and the Duskbloods, are not exactly the classic formula, so they're going in other directions because it's likely impossible to immediately follow up and innovate on Elden Ring because you honestly kind of can't without changing some major pieces. But why do I say that exactly? This may sound confusing or even overly pessimistic for some who have recently picked up Souls games, or if Elden Ring was your first taste of these types of games. But don't misunderstand me. My point at all is not to be pessimistic. Quite the contrary. In fact, as time has gone on, I've only grown more and more appreciative of Elden Ring, and I would probably go so far as to say that it might be my favorite video game of all time at this point. So in me saying that this formula may have reached its end is not a statement on Elden Ring not living up to expectations or anything of that nature. It's more an admission of how exceedingly magnificent a game like this truly is, and how I find it difficult to even comprehend how you make something bigger than this or that evolves from this. Elden Ring is the final form of the Souls formula, and I've debated with myself for a while about what they can even do from this point. That was until this past year, where FromSoftware released a brand new project called Elden Ring Night Rain, and I'm sure most of you are at least vaguely familiar, if not very familiar with this game, but in essence, it is not Elden Ring 2, it is not a DLC, at least in the sense that Shadow of the Erdtree is a DLC for this game. Night Rain is its own spin-off of sorts, using the same base mechanics of Elden Ring, but building upon them to make a survival roguelike game out of its weapons, enemies, and many of its bosses, with all brand new bosses in the form of Night Lords. Keep in mind, a major difference between Elden Ring and Night Rain is that Night Rain is a primarily multiplayer game with solo still playable, but the game's systems encourage cooperative play, whereas traditionally all Souls games have been a primarily solo experience with cooperative play on the side. The reason I'm bringing up Night Rain is because it has helped evolve my perspective on this question that I've had of what FromSoftware can do and go from here after Elden Ring. And in a lot of ways, it's given me some real hope about the future of this formula. Between both Night Rain and the base game of Elden Ring, I have thousands of hours of playtime. I've played through Elden Ring more times than I can count at this point, which, granted, with that amount of hours for anything will come with some degree of mastery over it and consequently changing your viewpoint on a lot of things, but also one game informs the other and vice versa. Elden Ring made me better at Night Rain, and Night Rain in turn has made me even better at Elden Ring. In fact, there is a ranked high difficulty mode in Night Rain called the Deep of Night. Each depth is a layer, 1 through 5, and 5 being the most difficult. This mode is brutal, and in depth 5, you basically have to play it like a no-hit run, especially in solo, but I cannot stop playing Depth 5 in Night Rain. It's addicting. It's extremely hard, but it's the fastest way to get better because every mistake is punished swiftly and without mercy, forcing perfection from you. Now, is it fun to play that way? Well, honestly, not all the time, since I would argue that Depth 2 and 3 allow for the game to really open up to you and to creatively utilize all of the new tools given, but Depth 4 and 5 start to analyze your playstyle and demand that you start using what you have to run to win and survive, and not necessarily what you want to use. So why am I bringing all of this up? That's because Night Rain Depth 5 is basically high altitude training for the base game of Elden Ring. So much so that when you play the normal game again, it kind of feels like the game is on story mode. Night Rain Depth 5 has evolved me as a player over time so that things that used to be roadblocks or threats that can stump you have become pushovers and largely trivial at this point. And it's important to mention this because I think, I started thinking about where they go from here. How do they keep the game challenging with an ever-improving player base, and how do they keep the gameplay engaging enough to justify that difficulty? We'll take all of that apart in due time. In fact, the DLC Shadow of the Erdtree might actually be as far as they can take the Elden Ring Souls formula when it comes to boss design. FromSoftware literally stated that they may have pushed players past the limits of what they can tolerate with boss difficulty in the DLC, and we'll investigate that idea a little bit more later on, but suffice to say that Elden Ring's difficulty, or at least perceived difficulty, is an inherent part of the identity and challenge this game provides. They inherently go in with the idea that they're not going to have a real difficulty slider on the main menu because they want to bring everyone to the same level of discussion when it comes to what is in the game and overcoming these challenges. That's a core part of this series. That being said, though, there always has been a difficulty slider in Souls games, and that is simply what you choose to use and how you interact with the game. You can make Souls games the easiest video game you've ever played with the right builds and conditions, or it can be legitimately borderline impossible to play depending on how you approach it as well. You are the difficulty slider. There isn't one in the menu, and that's what makes these games interesting because everybody has a vastly different experience because of how they approach the game. Yet, you still encounter the same challenges and roadblocks as they are, so you have something to relate to when talking to other people, and that's what keeps these games alive. The Souls formula, insofar as it began with Demon's Souls, that was a game primarily focused on levels as the challenge, with a boss at the end that requires a very specific and unconventional approach to defeat it. Dark Souls iterated on this idea by instead making it an interconnected branching world instead of distinct separated levels. Dark Souls 2 expanded the formula by having the first real kind of open world structure, similar to Elden Ring even in a way. Dark Souls 3 was a refinement of the original Dark Souls formula with a more sophisticated but more linear design that makes for a really curated, intentional, and impactful experience. And Elden Ring, mechanically and structurally, I think can be considered Dark Souls 4, this time with a truly open world, taking less of an emphasis on levels and bosses with unique solutions to more of a sprawling adventure with bosses at every corner that are much more combat-oriented. This is also a result of the Souls games generally getting faster over time. This is especially apparent in games like Elden Ring, Shadow of the Erdtree specifically, and Night Rain. Some fans for a while have felt that the games have gotten too fast for itself. While it's not exactly a secret that the general gameplay pace has gotten much quicker, it's also true that how you interact with the world has gotten much faster as well. However, after almost 4 years, Night Rain's release and the newfound perspective that all gives, Night Rain's gameplay makes Elden Ring feel incredibly slow by comparison. You see, in Night Rain, because of the context of that game and how it's on a time gate, they had to speed things up. Namely, you take no fall damage at all, so you can traverse areas very quickly and easily. You can climb, but most importantly, you can surge sprint. This is basically a super sprint that's much faster than the normal running in Souls games. This mechanic completely rewired my brain and changed how I played normal Elden Ring. The amount of times I tried to sprint only to go into a crouch, or jumped off a big-ass cliff only to lose all my runes and die instantly, I've done that more times than I'd like to admit. But still, the fact remains that I got used to the mechanical freedom and faster pace of Night Rain's combat that, at least in some ways, felt really slow coming back to regular Elden Ring. And sure, there's not really much difference between surge sprinting in Elden Ring Night Rain and riding on Torrent in terms of like covering ground, but the surge sprint kind of changes how you interact with some bosses and enemies, allowing you to quickly disengage, close the gap, or outspace certain moves that were built for the normal Elden Ring running. And I have to wonder if this mechanic will be integrated so that, they could open up new possibilities for the worlds and bosses in future titles. But playing Night Rain, it becomes clear that many of the encounters were simply not built with the surge sprint in mind. Honestly, though, I've gotten really used to this movement, and I actually quite like it as well. This is one way I could see them advancing the Souls formula into the future that opens brand new doors for design. Another thing that Night Rain's done that's changed my perspective is how the combat can flow. See, one of the big problems or issues with the Shadow of the Erdtree bosses, as far as I'm concerned, is that they're just so active and aggressive. That is the reason they're hard, is because they practically give you next to no time to even hit them. They tried to make the Shadow of the Erdtree bosses way harder by making them insanely active and that they never stop swinging, which is effective, I suppose, but it means that the Souls pacing of combat, where you sort of it's a give and take, it's a bit of a dance, you feel like you fall behind as a player, or you don't have the mechanics to keep up with the pace of the bosses. Some of the bosses' combat pacing makes them feel like they belong more in Bloodborne or even Sekiro than Elden Ring. Some people have started calling Elden Ring and these kinds of games roll slop. The fact that the whole time you're just mashing roll until you can swing one time and then repeat the cycle again and again. And while I don't agree in calling these games roll slop, as there's a lot more to it than that, some of these bosses don't really, help their case very much. I think after playing Shadow of the Erdtree, you can kind of see their point to some degree, even if you don't agree with it. It's just, that's sort of the issue, is that Elden Ring has so many cool spells. You look at how these later bosses are designed and how active they are, but Elden Ring has so many amazing abilities, Ashes of War and so on, but they all take so long to use that it's just not really practical to use like 90% of the inventory against Promised Consort Radahn. The problem, as far as I'm concerned, is that the bosses started to outpace what the player is capable of, especially the later DLC bosses. And so it means that there's basically nothing to do in combat except roll and wait for a very small opening with a light attack and not get too greedy. This is where I think Night Rain actually has some interesting ideas, in that they give you things to do other than rolling and waiting during combat. You have abilities and ultimates. For example, Wilder can fire a claw shot during combat. This doesn't use stamina and is not a light attack or a roll, and yet it's an action you can do in the heat of combat to tactically reposition, proc bleed, or something like that. Iron Eye can knife and dash through enemies, also acting as a dodge roll as it has iframes. Duchess can restage the last few seconds of damage on a boss, and so on. Now, of course, many of these are built with co-op in mind and for this kind of gameplay pace, and I'm not advocating for FromSoft to literally copy abilities into their next single-player game. What I am saying, though, is that they can add new player mechanics as well to keep up with the ever-increasing speed and aggression of the boss fights. Night Rain also proves to me that you can make tough and fun bosses without just making them stupidly active and unpunishable. The Night Lords kind of pull from Demon Souls' design philosophy a bit, wherein they all play very different and require sometimes unconventional methods to deal with. For example, Augur is very passive and avoidant and attacks from afar, making it very difficult for melee characters to ever get a hit in, but batting back its jellyfish will deal damage to him and potentially, knock him down. Everdark Libra is a ridiculously complex boss with basically MMO-style raid boss mechanics, and that fight isn't perfect in and of itself, but it shows me that you can make hard bosses again without just making them so active that they choke you out and give you no time to do anything. If you haven't played Night Rain yourself, this is a little bit hard to properly convey, but there are really no bad Night Lords exactly. I mean, well, okay, maybe just one, but there's ones that are more fun or preferable, but they all have enough nuance and depth to be engaging on their own and still challenging without just being a non-stop swinging machine. And you might be quick to discredit Night Rain as just like a silly co-op spin-off game that's not a real serious experience that is Elden Ring, but I truly feel like they have a lot of good lessons to learn from this title that will prove to be helpful in whatever they decide to do next. Elden Ring's main defining or best understood feature is its truly open world. Between the main game and the DLC, Elden Ring's selling point was that it was an open world Souls game, and I've been thinking a lot about what it means exactly to be open world. And in doing so, I think I've nailed down the reason that Elden Ring's open world really works for me, whereas many other games in the industry that purport to be open world absolutely do not. Firstly, having an open world does not mean that you just have big, vast play spaces. It goes way beyond the idea of even having optional content. I've noticed something about myself that I really like in video games as of late, and Elden Ring does all of that and some more. And notably, some of my favorite COD Zombies maps do this as well. In an abstract sense, the game gives you a goal, or an endpoint, but it does not care at all about which order or what manner you choose to do those operations in. Shadows of Evil in Black Ops 3 Zombies and Origins in Black Ops 2 are notable examples of this, but it's the same design philosophy here in Elden Ring, and I figure it might be best to illustrate my point with pictures and comparing the game's golden path to Dark Souls 3. I hate that I even have to say this, but I don't use AI for any part of my videos, my writing, scripting, editing, or anything. And you can tell that I don't use AI by how much my drawings suck. Anyways, a golden path is basically what you need to do to complete the game. It's pretty simple, but the golden path in this case is the main task you need to accomplish or the place you need to reach. Here's Dark Souls 3. This is the golden path that sees you starting in the first area or level and fighting the game's first mandatory boss. From there, you unlock the next level, but this time you actually have one or two optional bosses in that level that you can choose to engage with that are scaled for that level to help you face the next mandatory boss. Every time you beat a main one, another level is unlocked, and then a few more optional side bosses become available to you. The average player path kind of looks something like this. It's a linear climb up, doing optional side bosses as you gain access to them eventually, and then reaching the end of the game with the encounter of the final boss. There's nothing wrong with this structure at all. In fact, it can make for a very intentional and curated experience. This is how most video games are built, and Dark Souls 3 is one of my favorite Souls games of all time. However, Elden Ring is truly open world, because honestly, the game doesn't really make you do almost anything. There's like really only one or two true level barriers that are like mandatory to adhere to, and I'll illustrate this as an example. The golden path in Elden Ring is actually deceptively straightforward. There's really not a whole lot to it, right? It's get to the Erdtree, but in doing so, that's where the interesting part of the game comes in, because you have your opening regions in Limgrave, Caelid, and even Liurnia, but you don't actually have to fight any of these bosses though, at least for a while. Through various paths and options, you can explore but completely bypass Limgrave, Margit the Fell Omen, you can skip Stormvale Castle and Godric, you can even skip Rennala, and you can make it all the way to the capital past the Altus Plateau before even fighting a single major boss. What it means to be truly open world is to genuinely not make the player do almost anything, so that all of the content engaged with is completely voluntary. And that voluntary nature of interacting with a game is so completely different feeling on the brain than being forced to do something, and I cannot stress that enough. FromSoftware figured this out intelligently, and so the result is that they genuinely do not care about how much of the game you do or do not see. Many modern game developers have some egos about having to show off literally every part of their game to you, forcing you to do stuff so that you can see all the cool things they made. Elden Ring makes an outstanding world that goes beyond anyone's real expectations, but it does not force your hand in any way to interact with it, so that every discovery truly feels magical because you feel like you found it, you have some agency, and it's not the game handing it to you. The golden path of the player in Elden Ring can look like this, where you bounce around literally the entire map, encountering many optional bosses in other areas before even facing the first main bosses. You can even face other main bosses you're not really meant to at certain points. Ultimately, you'll end up at the same point regardless, though, as the game slowly starts to become less open world and and catalyzes into more linear sections. But the first few sections allow for so much room of expression and exploration that you can miss major parts of the game, and they really don't mind, which makes all that you do find that much more special. This is the real secret sauce to making an open world design work. And then the question then becomes, do I want FromSoftware's next big single player experience to be open world like Elden Ring? Well, it's hard to say, because it's truly actually difficult to even comprehend a world being bigger and more interconnected and intricate than Elden Ring's world in its entirety with the DLC included. I cannot even fathom how you get much bigger than this without making the game too big for itself. Elden Ring is a potentially massive game, but at the same time is actually a very small game when only looking at the mandatory content. This is actually where the true beauty of the game lies and why it has so much to offer, because Elden Ring can be a 100+ hour game, or it can be a 1 hour game for you, and it's entirely dependent on what you do and how you interact with that. And my point is that I'm not even sure how possible or practical it is to make another bigger and better open world than this, with the vast amount of spells, sorceries, weapons, ashes of war, infusions, the ability to literally change your stats and build at any point in the game. Clearly, this game is built around exploration, experimentation, and funnily enough, as the game starts to narrow in near the end and become less open to you, so too does your build, and your character start to catalyze and commit to a more specific playstyle. It all comes to a point near the end where it should. One of my initial critiques of Elden Ring's open world in a video I made a few years ago was that there was a fair amount of reused content in the form of either field bosses or dungeon enemies, and subsequently their rewards for going after them and spending your time clearing these dungeons unfortunately have a high probability of being completely irrelevant to your build, which is still kind of true even to this day, even though that there are literally hundreds of dungeons across the entire lands between and the DLC ones. A large amount of these can be skipped with no real downside, because most of their rewards are not likely going to be useful for your build, which is the drawback of having such a massive game in terms of square footage and weapons and items. And that video I made 2 years ago covering the base game's major bosses and some of the standouts, I went over those in detail already, so I won't retread a lot of them here. But what I will say up front and to set the stage is that it becomes clear as time has passed and the years have gone on that Elden Ring's boss design got significantly more complicated than the prior Souls games, but at the same time, we now have more tools than ever to deal with these bosses. This is where the entire debate of like if you're using summons or not, and why the act of summons became so controversial to begin with, because traditionally in Souls games, right, it was kind of a badge of honor to take the boss on by yourself, and it felt like a cop-out to use summons. But now it seems that like spirit summons are kind of integrated into the gameplay, and they're sort of built with the intentionality of that, and I think this is even more reinforced by the existence of Night Rain. Many of these bosses play just fine in a cooperative setting, or when it's more than just one-on-one. Now, clearly, there's ways to cheese every single boss, of course, but it's less about summons and more about how you're choosing to play. And so that sets the stage, because many of the game's most challenging bosses, or at least in the base game, are stuff like Melania, obviously, but the DLC basically has nothing but challenging bosses. Now, in order to even access the DLC, you first have to unlock a secret area, which is hidden behind another secret area. You can either get to Mohg's Palace, through a certain NPC quest, or you can get it by unlocking the consecrated snowfield. Either way, there's a handful of ways to get to Mohg's Palace, but after defeating the Lord of Blood, however long it takes you, you'll then get access to touch the withered arm, and thus Lady Letta is there to meet you, and this arm is the thing that takes you to the Land of Shadow. The long-awaited DLC expansion for Elden Ring came out in the summer of 2024, 2 years after the release of the initial main game, which as far as the industry standard of release timings for content is pretty late to drop 2 years after the game has come out. Nonetheless, Shadow of the Erdtree came out on June 21st and surprisingly was met with very mixed reviews, and the critiques ranged anything from the game is too hard, the bosses have annoying movesets and roll catch mechanics, to the performance internet sucks and is dropping frames and doesn't run well, to even I'm a Souls veteran and I've level 1'd every single game, but I'm calling this one quits. This took the overall sentiment from the base game being reviewed as very positive up to that point, to the DLC pack coming in at mixed reviews, which is quite unlike FromSoftware's track record, even to this day. I mean, now English reviews come in at very positive at this point over a year later, while recent reviews for Shadow of the Erdtree come in still as mixed. Clearly, there was something here that didn't work for everyone about this DLC, for some veterans and newcomers of the series alike. But what exactly was it and why? Well, first, what you're going to notice about Shadow of the Erdtree is right away its brilliant and spectacular visual presentation. You literally have that feeling of first walking into Limgrave for the first time. You walk out of the cave and you see the graveyard plains roll out in front of you, and then you see the ominous glow of the Shadow Tree. It instills this sense of doom and oppression right away. Atmospherically, I think I may actually prefer the Land of Shadow to a lot of the lands between. It's beautiful to look at in every single area, and it's just a real treat on the eyes. And it's also such a distinct contrast to a lot of the greens, blues, reds, and yellows of the lands between. The color palette usage serves as both a literal and metaphorical opposite to the lands between, and even an opposite to the Erdtree itself. But a player, as they wander around the plains, may encounter a dungeon with a knight inside, and be shown right away just how the rest of the DLC is going to go. These enemies don't play around and are no pushovers. See, I think the issue arose because of, how far the DLC has been removed from the main game, and the player base had 2 years to not only get better mechanically at the game, but also make broken builds and such, and, unlock all of the weapons and be really armed coming into this expansion, that there was probably a worry that players would chew through the DLC no problem and then end up feeling kind of underwhelmed by the end of the experience. So in order to address that, FromSoftware did something extremely controversial and is practically the main point of argument in the whole DLC. In order to put everyone on the same page, regardless of what you had done in the base game, they would introduce an item called Shadow Tree Fragments and Revered Spirit Ashes, which act as damage buffs and damage negation buffs in the realm of Shadow only, meaning that with each one you find, you have the option to slightly increase the damage you deal and decrease the damage you take with the Shadow Tree Fragments, and the same would be the case for the Revered Spirit Ashes for your spirit summons, and I believe Torrent as well. So these both had an effect of making you either more or less powerful depending on how many you use. This is the closest real in-game mechanic that we have to a difficulty slider. It's not unsimilar to like the gourd seeds and like the beads in Sekiro. Remember how I talked earlier about how the player in these games is the real difficulty slider as far as what you run, how high of a level you are, and that's still true to some extent, but in the DLC, they largely made your stats from the base game irrelevant, not literally, but you don't feel as much impact leveling up with runes in the Land of Shadow as you do in the lands between. In fact, they're not really stingy with handing out runes at all in the DLC either, and even regular enemies can give out tens of thousands of runes very easily, and for enemies that, are pretty easy to kill. I can't say for sure, but I think the point here was to give the player tons of runes so that they can easily level up to meet any of the requirements to use new spells, sorceries, and weapons they might encounter in this expansion, and less so to like overall, build your HP and tank all the bosses. Runes are purely meant for using the things on your build effectively, and the Shadow Tree Fragments are your main source of real damage dealing and damage negation for keeping alive in boss fights. This isn't a problem in theory. I don't have any issue with that, but its implementation certainly leaves some room for debate. Shadow Tree Fragments are mostly found at the beginning of major key areas and checkpoints of new regions, but not all of them. There's about 50 of these fragments total, and they range all the way from quite literally being handed to you to having to do parkour segments to reach a few of these. I suspect this system is at least in part most people's critiques of the DLC, if not a major component of it. One side of the argument argument might say that them being scattered all around encourages exploration and is not too unlike the golden seeds or sacred tears found in the golden trees or churches of America in the base game, respectively. And it is a solid argument, but I also think that because of the radically increased difficulty of the DLC compared to the base game, it starts to teeter on that edge of this is something you have to have, which, as I established earlier, really hurts the intention of a true open world when you're made to do something, or at least feel like you're made to do something. When you talk about the size and scale of the open world of the DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree isn't quite as open-ended as the main game, and you don't have the option to completely bypass a ton of major bosses. You can basically pick one of two main bosses to start out with, and you cannot access many of the other areas without breaking Miquella's charm first, which requires defeating at least Rennala. And I guess that isn't entirely true, as you can skip a lot of major bosses, and there's only a few mandatory ones, but the point is that in the early game specifically, you cannot bypass major sections of the game and pretty much rush to like the midpoint or end game right away. It's a little bit different here. You have to front load a few of the earlier bosses before you can skip a bunch of major ones if you so choose to do so. In that sense, the Realm of Shadow is a fair bit more linear in that way, which again isn't at all a bad thing. It's just worth noting. Most players open by discovering Belera and then climbing to the top to face the Divine Dancing Lion, which is one hell of a starting boss, I might add, and this was many people's first initial gut reaction to the DLC being bad or too hard. And while I'm not overly a massive fan of this boss either, it's at least interesting enough to make a statement on what the tone of this will be. It's an equally bold statement to have the Divine Dancing Lion as the first boss, just like how it still is a bold statement to make Margit the Fell Omen the first main roadblock of Limgrave. Beyond that, you see the stairs to Enir Elim, but you are blocked by the thorns of the Shadow Tree. Next is to clear Castle Ensis and defeat Rellana, Twin Moon Knight. There's nothing particularly interesting about this castle to me. It's pretty standard stuff as far as like castles or dungeons go, but Rellana is one of those bosses where the difficulty curve smacks you in the face and is a boss that is overly active and does not stop swinging. Rellana is actually more similar to Melania in terms of moveset and behavior than you might realize. One thing I've avoided talking about until now are the ever controversial and hot debate of summons. Although I feel recently this debate has died down a little bit, especially considering that the problem isn't really the summons themselves, and more of that people feel like there's a right way to play and a wrong way to play, and particularly the right way to play is to optimally challenge yourself. Back in the day, bosses were much slower and easier and more simple, and it was seen as kind of an admission of failure to have to summon somebody to get help through a boss. But this is also when bosses were more like turn-based combat and threw out a move once every 2 to 3 business days. Elden Ring, however, is unique in this regard, as spirit summons are kind of built into the very core of the game, and with the aggression, speed, and damage of Elden Ring's bosses in mind, the problem isn't whether or not you summon, as it doesn't really matter. The argument always falls on if you're playing the right way or not, which for most people, the way they consider the right way is the way that they played it, and any deviation from that is the wrong way to play or it's too cheesy. But as I mentioned, there's an almost infinite amount of ways to approach this game, and because of that, I think FromSoftware found it appropriate to crank up the boss difficulty for this DLC specifically because players would be approaching this with optimized builds, summons, and the most powerful stuff in the base game, so they needed to really compensate for that. This is why they front-loaded the DLC with some of the more challenging bosses for a first-time player. Rellana is a pretty good boss to me, however, and one that I actively still really enjoy fighting. She's one of those bosses that, especially when playing for the first time and learning her moveset, or even coming back after a while and trying to get back into the swing of things, you can actually feel yourself getting better and more proficient with each run, and that's how a good boss should be, where if you die, you blame yourself and not the game, and Rellana is an amazing boss for that. After you defeat her, the game opens up to you and you get access to most of the rest of the map. As you approach the Shadowkeep, Miquella's charm breaks, allowing you to access most of these other, regions that you can now explore. If you choose to go through the Shadowkeep, this is basically the portal to all kinds of other bosses and areas. It's kind of like a central hub, and you'll start out by fighting the Golden Hippo, and afterwards you can start by either climbing up or down the keep to get to various areas. One thing I really like about the DLC is how much the Shadowkeep feels like this central hub for the world and creates a distinct landmark for you to show how things are laid out. It also provides a highly concentrated area of Shadow Tree fragments. From here, depending on where you go, will ultimately determine what order of bosses you face. And similarly to the base game, there's only a couple of mandatory bosses from this point on if you just want to like complete and beat the DLC. But before Elden Rings DLC was released, Miyazaki had stated that the size of the Land of Shadow was approximately the size of Limgrave, which ended up being a severe understatement. In fact, the more I've played the DLC, the more I think that it's obviously not as big square footage wise as the Lands Between, especially like even just Limgrave itself. That area is huge, but it might be just as densely packed as the main game in terms of the overall breadth, width, and depth of content. There's just so much here to chew on as almost the entire base game, in my opinion. However, where the Land of Shadow and the Lands Between differ is particularly its layout structure, being much less sprawling and vast like the Lands Between are, and it's a lot more compact yet interwoven. There's a lot of layers to this world and this level design. There are regions that have map fragments that are not at all where you'd intuitively think they are or where you feel like they should be. You have to take these winding, twisted trails or even secret dungeons to access entire regions of the map. Across these regions of the Land of Shadow, there are a few interesting features to point out. Mainly, the Jagged Peak is a fairly linear region, all things considered, but with an immaculate visual presentation and an intense build-up leading up to its final boss, Baal the Dread, which is a bit of a shame because as much as this build-up is fantastic, the more I've played Elden Ring and the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, the less I actually care for Baal as a boss. He's the epitome of what I was talking about in regards to making a boss hard just because he's insanely active. Under normal conditions, dragon fights in Souls games have usually just been, dragons with massive health pools, hard-hitting attacks, and big AoEs, but also an inherent vulnerability in their tails and certain positioning underneath them. Those two tactics are like irrelevant with Baal. The first phase honestly isn't too bad at all, but phase 2 Baal is an entirely different story, and he has virtually no delays or any punish windows between his combos, which can include massive AoE strikes, ranged fire attacks, and so on. My main issue with Baal is that he's the most blatant example of this over-exaggerated active boss design. Caligo in Night Rain is a dragon fight that is done far better in my opinion and is still a pretty equal challenge, so much so that Baal doesn't even really feel like an archetypal dragon fight at all. I don't even know if I would say he's a bad boss, but he's probably got to be my least favorite major one in the DLC. Otherwise, you might encounter the Shadow Tree Avatar. This is a boss fight that is fairly unique because he's not overly active like some of the other counterparts in this game, but he's also by no means passive either. You do have your basic AoE moves, a few tracking thorns that can proc bleed, and some magic to dodge, but it's a real surprise to find out that after you kill him and draining his health, you land a critical hit, he will fade away as expected, only for a few seconds later to rise from the ground once more and charge at you from across the entire arena. You do the same thing again, rinse and repeat, and after killing him a second time, yet again, he rises for a third time, this time with the biggest health pool and most devastating AoE attacks. It is certainly not the most challenging boss of the entire DLC, but I feel myself and most players are pretty favorable, at least to this boss. It's worth mentioning that this is a very optional boss, so you really kind of have to go out of your way to find the Shadow Tree Avatar, but he's still fun to fight, and I have absolutely no issues with him. Next is Messmer the Impaler, pretty much the face of the DLC in a lot of ways, and is not only genuinely a mechanical masterpiece of a boss, and a visual spectacle at that, but I also feel like Messmer is where I saw the most community outcry at the time as being a prime example of the DLC being too hard. There were multiple and countless clips of people getting smoked by Messmer, and like that's kind of the point point of these games. That's some of the fun, is watching everybody struggle with a few of the hard bosses. And look, there's no doubt that the DLC bosses are remarkably harder than the base game. But again, it's kind of a Souls tradition at this point to have all of the hardest bosses found in the game's respective DLC. Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, and even Bloodborne all have their most difficult fights in their expansions. Regardless, Mesmer is a tough but fair challenge to learn at first. His first phase isn't too bad, but his opening moves primarily punish running or rolling away from him, which is appropriate to his lore, I suppose, but the trick in the first phase is just to stay close and, for the most part, not back down. In phase 2, Mesmer gets significantly more challenging because he then integrates the base serpent, and these moves are where the visual spectacle comes in, and some of these moves can be extremely devastating as well. But at the same time, he still has most of his moves from phase 1, so if you master these, then phase 2 really isn't all that much more challenging to get a handle on, but there's just a few more unexpected surprise moves you now have to take into account. But phase 2 is also very doable, and it's also one of those things where I feel like Mesmer and R'hllana are some of my favorite ones in the DLCs, and they're over too quick at some point. Sure, Mesmer is significantly more challenging than not only the base game bosses, but even some of the DLC ones, but not in a way that I would consider to be too much. There's also Commander Gaius, which isn't too far away from Mesmer, which is your typical lanceman on horseback type of enemy, except it's not a horse this time, it's a boar, and that changes the dynamics of combat a little bit. Namely, this time, you can't rely on knocking out the horse and then taking on the rider by himself like you can for some other ones like the Knight Riders, but the boar can also deal significant damage to you as well, and at about the midway point through the fight, Gaius then gets access to gravity magic. For whatever reason, I always find Gaius to be more of a struggle for me than pretty much any other boss that came before him. I don't really know why, but your reward for defeating him is a massive collection of precious Shadow Tree fragments as they have collected here. This is one of the best moments to uncover for the first time in the entire DLC, and I'll never forget how I felt after struggling through Gaius to be greeted with this amazing reward. Something I found interesting about how they designed the DLC is their modified approach to dungeons, where in the base game you have typically 1 to like 3 layers at most, with 1 grace point at the beginning. In the DLC, the dungeons have multiple layers that go on for much, much longer, and there are even multiple sites of grace found within the same dungeon. I found this odd in some ways, especially considering that the time investment for completing a dungeon is, so high comparatively that you'll probably have your build in mind and already catalyzed by the time you get here, that its rewards may again not even be very helpful. But more so, I found the increased danger and length of the dungeons to be curious. In fact, one of the dungeons that goes particularly deep leads you to the Abyssal Woods, an entirely unique and unbelievably atmospheric area that's tainted with frenzy, such that Torrent will not even join you. He gets too scared and refuses to be summoned, meaning you have to deal with this entire section on foot. There are some interesting things to find here, like the winter lanterns that are unkillable unless parried first, but eventually you'll stumble across Midra's Manse, a small linear dungeon in this area. Midra's Manse is a fantastic section full of puzzles, secret doors, hidden walls, challenging enemies, shortcuts, and so on. All of the good classic stuff, leading all of the way to the encounter with Midra himself, who you could hear wailing throughout your time traversing the Manse. Midra is a boss that I like more and more as I play Elden Ring, as opposed to Baal, who I've grown to like less and less over time. Midra is a fight that I always really look forward to. That feels like Mesmer in a way, where he's very tough but extremely fair. The trick to this one is staving off frenzy and avoiding some of the more offbeat and off-rhythm moves. Midra has fantastic visuals, as well as mechanics that complement the play space and the environment. I'd say he's around as tough as some of the harder base game bosses, but nowhere near unfair or overtuned in any sense. If you make your way from the bottom of the map with the Cerulean Coast, you'll eventually then find yourself staring down the abyss of the Stone Fissure, a tomb full of putrescence that seeps to the very nether. The first initial reveal of all of these areas truly never get old. The attention to detail at every level of analysis reveals even more detail that you can only really appreciate on repeat playthroughs. There isn't a whole lot to find in this area in terms of puzzles or rewards, but the final platform requires a leap of faith from you, to plunge below to find and encounter St. Trina, but with the putrescence dripping, it coalesces into the boss of this region, the Putrescence Knight. This is an extremely interesting fight to me because it's fighting this boss somehow. It becomes clear that FromSoft really tried to integrate jumping as a defensive option in addition to the normal roll here. Jumping is extremely effective for a large portion of the Putrescence Knight's moves, which is a way for them to try to add more unusual methods at dealing with a boss. I would say this is another boss that suffers from maybe being a little bit too active or avoidant. It feels almost unnatural for a boss to be moving this quickly all of the time without the appropriate cooldown, but all in all, it really isn't a massive offender of what most people don't like about this DLC. Amusingly enough, after defeating the knight and encountering St. Trina, you can drink the nectar that she offers you, only to just literally die right then and there. But if you do this 4 times, you then get secret dialogue from her instead.
Don't turn the poor thing into a god. Godhood would be Michaela's prison. A caged divinity is beyond saving.
There's a few other optional bosses like Meteor, Mother of Fingers, but the only real mandatory boss after that is Romina, Saint of the Bud. She's found at the end of the Ancient Ruins of Ra area, which on the one hand is my absolute favorite area in the game visually. Genuinely spectacular art design. I just honestly don't care for the layering and maze-like nature of the navigation of this region too much. There's so many cliff sides where you try to want to feel like you want to find the right ledge to make it down there, but you literally can't, and instead you must venture through the maze, inside the caverns, and all of that stuff. But there's just a handful of smaller bosses to encounter here, but it's still my favorite place in the whole DLC just to spend time in and to look at. The final encounter of this area, however, is against Romina, who, for her placement as the checkpoint to the final area of the game, is oddly way easier, or at least in comparison, that is. She feels much more like a base game Elden Ring boss in terms of difficulty and behavior, and I can see why they did this, since making a mandatory fight way too hard could prevent players from just completing the game, so they can make the optional bosses literally as hard as they want to, which is exactly why Malenia is hidden away in a secret area behind another secret area behind a secret puzzle that must be accessed by a secret medallion to begin with. Romina, being a much less mechanically demanding boss, is honestly kind of a refreshing confidence boost at this point if you've defeated all of the other DLC bosses up to now. You then burn the thorns of the Shadow Tree Veil and reveal the hidden city of Enir Alim, which at this point I think is other than Raw is my favorite area in any Souls game visually. This entire area is absolutely breathtaking, magnificent, and genuinely awe-inspiring to look at. The art is just something that inspires and serves its purpose as being a finale area. Truly, I don't have the words to express how much I like looking at this region, and I would say that I don't care for all of the enemy encounters in this section either, but I'll put up with them because the visual playspace is just too beautiful to pass up on. The spiraling tower and the spiral spells you see and gain access to is as thematically appropriate as it is fun to play with. Speaking of beautiful areas, there's a secret location that you can get access to behind the Shadow Keep after moving a statue of Marika by doing a specific gesture in front of it. Here you can find the shaman village where Marika's tribe lived. Here the music changes and the most attention to art and and visual storytelling was done here. You can find a Holy Braid, which heavily negates holy damage, which just might be a hint as to what you're going to need for the final encounter. When you get near the top, Lady Letta and her allies attempt to stop you from killing Miquella. This is a multi-NPC fight that changes in difficulty depending on how many quests in the DLC you've done. After defeating your former collaborators, and you ascend the final spiral rise to face the DLC, and thus Elden Ring's true final boss.
My loyal blade and champion of the festival. Both your deeds will ever be praised in song. Now, the vow will be honored, and my lord brother's soul will return, so that he may be my consort. Lord brother. At long last you are returned. Tarnished one. Aspiring lord of the old order. If you have known sin, if you grieve for this world, then yield the path forward to us. To I, Miquella, and my promised consort, Radahn.
Promised Consort Radahn is what got the community talking about Elden Ring again the way that Melania got the community talking about it the first time around. Before we discuss why he's so controversial, we should talk about how this fight is structured. The first phase is against Radahn in his prime, which, if you're familiar with his encounter in Caelid, he is way more challenging here. However, this phase is tough, but it actually doesn't last too long. At about 60% HP, he'll initiate phase 2, and in which Miquella joins him as Radahn as his promised consort. Radahn has all of the same moves from the first phase, but even more this time, and with stronger and more holy hitboxes afterwards, and a couple of new moves as well, including a grab attack, which, if landed, the first time won't kill you. Miquella picks you up and tells you about this 1,000-year voyage guided by compassion. Miquella charms you, but lets you back down. However, if you're grabbed twice, he steals your heart and the fight is immediately over. However, the reason this boss is so controversial is because of how perceived it is to be overtuned, active, and one really bullshit move. So much so that Radahn was actually nerfed shortly after the DLC was released. Not only did they eventually patch the vanilla version of Radahn in the base game, but they had to patch the DLC Radahn as well. Now, which move of his was bullshit, you may ask? In the pre-patch version of Radahn, he does this cross slash that is a complete frame trap that comes out literally faster than the average human reaction time, and it's a move that kind of breaks the rules of Souls fights because this cross slash is a guaranteed hit basically 999 times out of 1,000. Apparently, though, the way to deal with this was to backstep first and then roll under the second swing, but that just wasn't happening for most players and people, and everybody was getting hit by this, and it was essentially unavoidable. Myself included, this kind of frame trap move was just something that broke the rules a little bit. And so they nerfed Radahn, and post-nerf cross-slash looks a little more like this. Now comes out a little slower, and the second hit is delayed for just long enough for you to reliably roll under both of these. Now, do I feel a sense of pride and accomplishment knowing that I beat Radahn while he was pre-patch? Yes, of course I do. But at the same time, I also think that Radahn now is a better boss fight, objectively, for having this move adjusted like this. Of course, the fight feels more fun and fair after this nerf, but I also understand that there is, to some degree, going to be some pride for having beaten him in his, pre-nerfed form. I understand the impulse of FromSoftware to make the final boss of this game that it will ever have to be over the top and this insurmountable challenge, and honestly kind of go too far in some ways. Just like I would argue Malenia goes too far in some ways. But you at least need to make it a very memorable way to end the DLC. But as you're watching the gameplay, or especially if you fought him yourself, Radahn is the definition of slightly overtuned. And that's because it's a boss that is entirely too active. When you talk about roll slop, in Phase 2, you basically have to wait through like 3 different combos, 17 individual swings to be over, tons of holy hitboxes to subside, before you get to choose between a single heal or getting one light attack in. Yes, any boss that active will make the game hard, sure, but as I've noted with Night Rain, it's possible to make extremely challenging yet fun and fair bosses where you feel like you can actually do more than just 20 rolls followed by a single attack for 10 minutes straight. I used to say that PCR was the hardest Souls boss ever made before he was patched, and I still believe that, but after his patch, I think I would have to actually hand that title back over to Malenia after she lost it temporarily to Promised Consort Radahn. Was it the right call for FromSoftware to nerf him? Well, I'll let you guys be the judge of that and decide for yourself, but if you manage to successfully defeat Radahn and not lose everything, including your mental willpower and sanity in the process, it's actually very amusing to go back to the base game and then face the final boss of, base Elden Ring. It makes it feel like a tutorial. Radagon of the Golden Order is your last roadblock before ultimately choosing an ending in Elden Ring, and he's a perfectly well-designed boss that, comparatively speaking, feels incredibly simple again. When I made my original Elden Ring review a few years back, I had been critical of this boss fight, not really for anything to do with Radagon himself, but other than the teleporting moves and instant holy hand blasts that I don't really care for. They're not, boss-breaking problems for me, but my issues were more with the Phase 2 with Elden Beast. Particularly, it was rough for melee characters as the arena was so big, and as soon as you caught up to him, he would leave and go to the other side of the arena again. It was this extremely tedious game of tag with these massive AoEs and huge moves to dodge. This was a hassle on foot and kind of a slog, and I had specifically said that I had found it weird that we couldn't use Torrent in this fight. It would make sense both thematically and mechanically, yet for the first 2 years of this game, we couldn't do that at all. But unexpectedly, FromSoftware released an update randomly one day that gave us the ability to utilize Torrent in this fight, and this alleviated just about every single one of my issues and complaints with Elden Beast. I really don't know why we didn't have access to him from the very start, nor why it took them literal years to make this change, but nonetheless, it makes the fight feel infinitely better nowadays, and is still a fantastic visual spectacle as well to cap off the Elden Ring experience. Elden Ring is a game that is renowned for its difficulty and its signature open world, yet it is precisely its difficulty that people are looking for, and it's the catalyst for discussion, but it is also the most divisive thing about it. The DLC was fascinating to me because the paradox of enjoying Elden Ring because it's a hard game, yet also some people being turned off by it because it's hard, is just as paradoxical as it is true sometimes. I think after some real time has passed and the dust is settled after Shadow of the Erdtree's release, I can genuinely say that the DLC is overall fantastic, but I would say that it suffers from the late stage difficulty issue, where FromSoftware had not too many options but to push their game, the bosses, and consequently the players to their absolute limits. I get why the DLC gets all the praise that it does and is so highly rated, and for myself, I feel like it is truly remarkable. Yet to some degree, I can also completely understand why some players gave up after this one, especially if the formula they felt had reached its endpoint, or the farthest possible extension may have been exhausted at this point, or overstayed its welcome by being obnoxiously difficult in certain moments. This is why, in some sense, I don't think there ever could be an Elden Ring 2, for a lot of reasons actually, but this being a major one. I feel like in order to reintroduce that feeling of challenge and difficulty, right now they'd have to design bosses to be even more complex, active, and aggressive than the DLC ones. And at that point, I'm not even sure if I'd be interested in playing something like that. And I'm sure a lot of people kind of feel that way too. There could be a point where it truly enters roll slop territory if they allowed this to go farther than it did in the DLC. And I don't think I really want to go there or play that game. But that's not to say that a game full of challenging bosses, discovery, and overcoming obstacles won't work. In fact, that's not true at all, because that formula will never get old. That's something that is as old as time and people will always be interested in. That's why I think Night Rain can be so pivotal in a lot of ways, because that game introduced new ideas for combat and gameplay mechanics that advance on the Souls roll and attack formula, and they can make hard bosses that are challenging but not bullshit as well. Clearly, at the current moment in time, FromSoftware is mostly focusing on multiplayer titles, Night Rain and the Duskbloods included. They haven't completely abandoned the idea of, these slow burn single player RPGs though, and I'm sure they're actively working on something still, but I have to imagine that what they wanted to do with Elden Ring is they kind of already did it. So I'm not sure what they're even supposed to do next from this point, and hopefully this video maybe sparked some interesting thoughts for you or what they could do in the future. But I feel like Elden Ring is kind of the end of the Souls formula, as it were, without seeing some major advancements to the overall core of the game. I did have one idea though that could allow them to make an entirely brand new game with different possibilities and open doors beyond of what we even thought were possible, because all of the Souls games run in 60 frames. That's because the bosses work off of frame data, so 60 frames helps keep everything consistent. But if they ever got to a point where we could see Souls games with the same kind of combat fundamentals but running at 120 frames or something like that, then they have the possibility to make even more interesting bosses off of that frame data. It's more of a technical thing, but I could see them going that way in the future. Either way, I'm going to be keeping an eye on everything that FromSoftware puts out. I'm going to be playing Elden Ring whenever I feel like it, because it's one of my favorite games of all time, and I'm going to be playing Night Rain a ton as well, and the Duskbloods when that comes out next year. But until then, I'm sure they're working on something big for single player. I'd wanted to re-review Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree for quite a while, so let me know what you guys think. Make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you later.